Hello everyone, this is FIDE Master Viktor Neustroyev. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I hope the sound and video quality is good. So today we are going to talk about Larsen opening, the first move b3. And I would like to demonstrate the game played by the author of this opening, Bent Larsen, and how he was defeated. Not in all his games he was losing. Of course, he thought that this opening is quite competitive. However, it was mainly because people didn't know how exactly to play against it. Okay, thank you. The sound is good. The video should be fine. People are joining. So those who live in Europe, if I'm not mistaken, you changed your time to summertime today. So that's why for you, the webinar starts 1 hour later, right? Okay, fine. So, well, if you join this webinar for the first time, just let me know what your rating is and which country you are from. So this webinar is recorded, as well as it is streaming on YouTube at the Chesslands website and at the chessworld.com YouTube channel. Okay, fine. So what we're gonna start first? Well, first of all, I would like to ask you guys how you play against b3. So imagine b3 is played. What would you do, and which strategy would you initiate with black pieces here? What are your suggestions? So Brian would play King's Indian, started with knight f6, then d6. Well, actually, then g6, fiancetta, d6, e5, and so on. Yeah, definitely e5 or d5 are two best moves in this position. I would myself probably start with d5 because I'm more used to play positions with the pawn on d5, which happens in Slav, semi-Slav, and sometimes in Sicilian. Okay, so e5, d6, g6, bishop g7, and knight g7 with knight c6 is also a possible strategy. Okay, so, well, first of all, we need to understand what our opponent wants to do. With the b3 move, well, he's definitely going to fiancetta, and the key square here becomes e5. What you can do is you can just play e5 and make your pieces protecting this pawn, and you won't experience any problems there, I believe. Or maybe you will, but you'll find a way of how to defend this pawn. So it's completely fine. And today I'm going to demonstrate you two options, how to play e5 and how to play d5. Well, because I play d5 myself, it's also helpful webinar for me because there are a few things that you can be afraid of when you play d5. For example, what about the e5 square? What if this guy plays knight f3, knight e5, supported with the bishop, and then holds the position of the knight by pushing the f4 pawn? I'm going to show you what happens that. Actually, looking forward, I can say that you have enough resources to get this knight from e5 undermined. You can exchange and undermine with f6 or just attack it with two knights and one bishop. So the first game I would like to demonstrate is the game played between Bent Larsen and Boris Spassky. Maybe some of you have already seen this game because this is a very famous game. So b3, e5, bishop b2, knight c6, and c4. So this time Larsen plays c4. Well, why he plays c4? He wants to control the d5 square because, well, he cannot fight for the e5 fully. Knight f6, knight f3, attacking the pawn, and in this position, well, some people would consider playing d4. I mean d6. However, d6 doesn't look good because of d4. And then what? Well, it can be King's Indian, but very specific King's Indian. Well, and if you decide to take, it actually favors white because nothing can stop them to play e4 in future, and they have a strong center control and better development. So people who play b3 usually do not always neglect the center. They do not fight for the center right away, but they have in mind the idea of attacking the center with their opponents later in the game. They just want to keep more flexibility with this move. Okay, so e4, this is what Boris Spassky played. Knight goes to d4, and bishop c5, attacking this knight. This is where Bent Larsen made a mistake. He took on c6. Of course, the d pawn takes. Well, taking with the b pawn is a possibility, but then you have to play b5. Oh, I mean d5 with the pawn. But if you do this move, you speed up your development. Well, actually, he'd better play this move, adding some pressure here because he has an open diagonal, but at the same time, it is not so promising. Let's say castle, e3, d5, c takes d5. We cannot take with this knight because we lose here, but we can use the other knight. So, because we also attack the knight on f5, it has to move, and then we can take here on d5. Peter, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the knight on f5 was hanging during that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's one of the reasons why we need to move uh, the d pawn forward and attack it. So here, because our knight is hanging, it makes sense to not capture on f5 immediately, but play something like that. But not something like that because they can take and ruin our pawn structure. So yeah, that still works really well. So why black pieces are active enough? Well, if you are afraid, you can capture with this knight. But even with this knight, you're completely fine with this move. Knight takes e4. Well, at least because of this. And if they take here after knight c2, their king is in a danger. Maybe rook e8, maybe knight f4, but this is a deadly attack anyway. At the very worst scenario, you take on e1, but I don't think you need it. It should be a winning position. So let's make the move. So let's say this. Well, what if he tries to escape with the king? Then we can do this move. Take, rook takes, and then he loses his queen. Okay, what about something else? Let's say this move. Then knight f4 is coming, king escapes. Knight h5, queen d5 becomes a threat. Yeah, a bit risky. Well, I don't think we should continue the analysis of this position. Let's go back. So you are actually completely fine with knight f5 move, and this is what I think Boris Spassky had in mind when he played it. And after knight c6, d takes c6, white seems to be okay. They don't have any weaknesses in their position, but the point is that they struggle with development, and this is what black takes advantage of. So e3, bishop f5. So the idea of bishop f5 move is to stop d3, because this pawn becomes quite annoying. It controls this square, and if this pawn is exchanged, then white is fine, and at least the position becomes equal. But when the bishop on f5 stops it, it's not so easy to keep developing pieces. Queen c2, queen e7, bishop e2, and let's decide. How would you play in this position for black? Okay, so looks like everyone wants to castle long. Don't you think it's risky? Okay, so no, it's not risky. It's completely fine. So castle. And well, how do they initiate the attack? Moreover, have in mind that you have an extra pawn on the queen side. So you have 4 versus 3, which means that before initiating the pawn march, they have to exchange your c6 pawn, and only then they will attack your king. So that means that the king is safer. And now, after this move, all black pieces are into the attack. So what black can do? So probably something like that, and bring the knight to d3. Or maybe instead focus on the attack of the f2 pawn. Well, something like a3 would be a possible move. Then maybe queen goes to e6, and after b4, the bishop goes back to e7. Well, seems to be the best way for white to continue, but Bent Larsen, because his original idea was to control e5 with his opening, he played f4. Well, this time e takes f en passant doesn't make any sense because queen f5 is played with a check, and then bishop takes on f3. So then black simply loses a pawn. That's why f4 is actually possible. And if f4 is possible, then maybe some activity on the king side is blocked for black. There is also the control over this square, which means knight g4, knight e5, knight d3 doesn't work anymore because of inability to play knight e5. So Bent Larsen evaluated this position to be okay for him. Then he considered it to castle king side and so on. Keep developing his pieces. But that was actually a huge mistake, because with this move, he opens his king side. So knight g4. This move becomes a threat, because even if g3, queen h3, and the queen enters the enemy camp. So that's why g3 was played first. Well, why not to play this move? Well, I don't see the point of doing this move, actually. Let's say rook g8, then bishop goes back. And we have a lot of options in this position. So well, what comes to your mind? Well, I know there is queen h4 move, which you need to calculate, but maybe you have something else? So bishop takes e3, bishop takes e3, f takes, d takes e3, then what? Knight takes. Yeah, it seems to be a very strong attack. g2 is captured then. Okay, so one candidate move. What else? Knight takes e3 by John. Okay, bishop b4 by Brian. Well, bishop b4, well, probably they play knight e3 after that. I don't think this is a good idea because they block it. Okay, so knight e3 works in this position. After this move, how do we continue? Queen h4? Yeah, I think queen h4 is fine. Well, rook g2 is fine too, but we can take here with the rook. Why not? This is a checkmating threat, so they take, we take, they move the king there. And then bishop e3 should be a winning move. So how do they save? They can save only by moving the bishop. Well, something similar actually happened in the game later. So bishop h5, how would you play in this position? Well, rook d1 doesn't work because of bishop d1. Well, rook d2 makes sense. If knight d2, this is a mate. However, they may sacrifice the queen. And if you decide to take the queen, then it's still winning, but maybe you just don't have enough material. Because they have too many pieces. Well, maybe queen of check here. Well, I think it's winning, but well, we have to calculate the position deeper to realize that the queen and bishop are stronger than two rooks and three minor pieces. One minor piece should be lost, I think, but not two. So it's a bit unclear for me. So rook d2 may not work. Okay, bishop b6, bishop takes b6, rook d1, queen f2. Ah, g6, you mean? Well, if he takes on g6, what if he doesn't? What if he plays, for example? Well, it's a good question. Bishop g6, how else they can play? What if they play... No, queen g2. Yeah, what if they play queen g2? Because now there is still no rook d1 because of this bishop. And the queens are about to get exchanged. So actually, bishop h3. Bishop h3 because, well, blocking with the queen doesn't make sense. King e2 leads to checkmate, right? So take, then queen g1, check, king e2, and queen f2 is still a checkmate. So bishop h3 is the best option. So, yeah, taking on g7 would be a disaster. Well, I don't need to calculate bishop g7 line to tell that such a move is a mistake. So it's easy to realize that bishop g7 is a mistake because black lags in development, and taking the pawn on g7 only allows black to activate a rook, and white just loses a temper. So, I mean, black with the g file being open, black brings more pieces to the attack, gains a few tempi, and then may continue their attack. So because of no development of white pieces. If, for example, there was already knight somewhere and the king was able to castle, then I would calculate whether bishop g7 is a good move for white or not. But here I just completely understand that such a move just cannot be a good move because the white's king's position is unsecured, and with more pieces attacking it, for example, with the rook on g8, I'm more likely to succeed with the attack. Okay, fine. Let's go back. So let's continue. G3 was played. G3, well, here Spassky plays H5. He wants to undermine it and enter the enemy camp with one rook. So imagine such a situation, even if this rook is protected and they somehow are exchanged, then because these pieces are not developed, the other black rook joins the place of action, which now switches to the king's side. H3 was played. Now, how would you play in this position? Well, knight f6 back. Well, knight h6 is the second option. Maybe you can sacrifice the knight on e3. Looks like knight a3 is a bit optimistic. Yeah, so it's, well, it's not h5, it's h4, John. We already played h5, so it's h4, right. Yeah, what's the point? Because once we take on g3, even without a knight, our pawn becomes stronger and can be promoted. For example, that was the best move, but even if that happens, h takes g3 and we enter the enemy camp. And if he takes on g3, it's simply queen h4 and he loses a rook. So in the game was something similar with the bishops on the board. H takes g3, rook g1 was played, but this time with the bishops on the board, instead of just doing rook h2, which is a good move anyway, black found a better move. Can you please find it? Okay, so we will go back to the opening later after we finish the analysis of this game. Yeah, we can discuss whether he could play d3 and what it could lead to. I don't think that there was a real opportunity to play d3. We'll see. Yeah, so I think here John is correct again. It's rook h1. How to play? Well, just bringing the king doesn't work because of queen h4, and we are threatening to take, then do this and checkmate on f2, and I don't really see any defense here. Okay. So rook takes h1, g2. If the rook goes up, it's g1 equals queen. If the rook goes here, then queen h4. King goes to d1, queen h1. So to get the queen to another queen to h1, and how to play. So they have no ideas of how to protect. For example, this move would be a disaster because of g1 equals queen. So this queen has to be taken now, and then they block, and it's a mate. So that's why what they can do is just let their king to escape. But this is a losing position, of course, because you simply promote. So in the game, it was rook f1 played. Queen h4, check. Well, rook f2, it's g1 equals queen, so the king goes to d1, but then the position is completely lost. It's this, bishop takes, and there is a checkmate in 2 moves. Can you find it? So yes, it's bishop takes g4. Well, it's actually not in 2, but in 3. Bishop takes g4, king c1, and queen e1. He has to block with the queen, and then you take it. So it's actually in 3. If in this position they block, then it's checkmate in 2 with queen h1. Fine. So yeah, let's go back to the very beginning. There was a question by Peter. So they played bishop e2. If instead they continued with d3. So what do you think how we should play in this position? I still think that this move is a bit risky. Well, we can castle right away, provoking them to take, and then with bishop e4, we will chase the queen away. And well, let's look at this line. Castle, for example, take, take. Then the queen has to move, and it has to move to c1 only, after which it's obvious who dominates in the game. So we can, for example, bring the other rook, and this bishop is tied down to the g2 pawn. If f3 played, then e3 becomes a weakness. So we can, for example, take on b1 and play bishop e3 with a winning position. We always have in mind this move, or then knight has to go on c3, where it becomes pinned. So this is one of the options. The other is quite simple. Take, take, queen takes, rook here. Then what? Well, these squares are unavailable. The queen may go to e2, let's say. But then we have this check. And I think that in this position, doing this move is a mistake. Why? Well, after knight e4, you are increasing the pressure, as well as you want to bring the rook to d2, and then the game is over. So that's why the queen probably has to retreat to c2, but then it's still a check, and then he loses his castling privilege and experience problems with development. For example, after this move, it's knight e4, and now knight c3, well, still doesn't look so good. If he plays knight c3 in this position, we can do this move, queen takes, and we can take here, having the rook on the second rank, and this is a must. Then knight goes back, but black dominates in this position. Okay, there was a suggestion to block this check with bishop c3. Okay, so check, he blocks. Yeah, that makes more sense, I agree. Then we can just castle and we're just slightly better. Okay, so maybe in this position just this is a good move. So castle, well, maybe there is an attack, but let's castle ourselves. And even if we move the knight here, we're gonna get the control over the d3 square. So yeah, well, white doesn't lose immediately if he plays d3, but his position is clearly better. With playing bishop e2 and doing f4, here, white wanted to make the position more complicated, where he could have potential chances to outplay his opponent. But, well, and in this position with d3 instead, I think he would experience serious problems. Okay, fine. So yeah, it could make sense to play d3 instead of bishop e2. That's right. But anyway, white would struggle with, well, with serious problems because black pieces are much more active. Okay, so, well, what was the reason that helped? What was the main mistake, or what was the reason why black won this game? So, of course, that was better development. Black quickly developed their pieces and occupied the e4 square with their pawn, which prevented the white pieces from development. And because of that, they obtained a lot of tactical opportunities that they later realized. So, well, your opponent, if he plays b3 with the first move, definitely is familiar with the game Larsen versus Spassky, and of course he knows it. But, well, I mean that this exact situation may not happen in your game. However, at least you understand that if against b3 you develop your pieces quickly and get the central control, you won't be in trouble and the position will be more favorable for you rather than for your opponent. So that's why actually I consider b3 to be not a good move at all, and I wouldn't play this opening. Maybe only in a blitz game and only to surprise my opponent. The second game we are going to talk about is the game between Bent Larsen and Anatoly Karpov. This time Bent Larsen was defeated once again, but this time with the d5 move. So d5, bishop b2, knight f6. Well, people who play knight f6 first after bishop b2 may also continue with d5. e3, e6. f4, well, this is the most common strategy because the control over the e5 square is the original goal. Why people play this strategy with quick queenside bishop development. Well, here Karpov decided to play b6 because this bishop is definitely bad. The e-pawn won't go to e5, so that's why this bishop should be developed in a different way, and he wants to put it to b7, which will provide him with the control over the e4 square in future. Bishop e2. So, which move would you suggest for black in this position? There is nothing specific. I just want to understand how you think that black should fight for the center in this position. Okay, Peter, c5, and then which move? And what c5 may provide you with? Okay, so Craig suggests bishop c5. So two candidates. c5, bishop c5. Can you please, guys, clarify your plan? If you can also unmute yourself and pronounce it. Okay, we also have another plan by John. Okay. Okay, let's discuss it. So first of all, I don't think that bishop c5 is a good move because I'm sure that they play d4 at a certain moment. And what your bishop is attacking here, if you can later maybe do this move, that bishop c5 would be helpful enough. Uh-huh. But right now, well, you do provoke d4, then you bishop b4, then they play c3, for example. You go back to d6 maybe or e7, and they have a stone wall actually. So yes, maybe this bishop isn't perfect, but now they have a very solid pawn structure and they occupy e5. Well, so I'm not saying that playing that this pawn structure provides him with some certain advantage. I'm just saying that, well, yeah, he improved his position a little, but you played several useless moves. Also, actually, in this position, I think they play knight d2 instead, because it's better to bring the knight rather than to play with the pawn once again. And then they castle, and I don't understand what the bishop is doing on b4, because we definitely don't want to exchange it for the knight on d2. So provoking d4 doesn't look good. Well, c5 is possible. c5, knight c6, and it controls the d4 square. So, so in my opinion, well, not in my opinion, but objectively, Peter suggested the best plan from a strategical point of view. And I think that the reason is that it's because Peter is my student and he learned it in our lessons. Okay, so the d4 square is important. That's why c5 is a must. But let's talk about the John's plan because it is an interesting idea. So bishop d6. No, let's say they keep developing pieces. Then well, knight d7, and then queen e7 with the idea of fighting for this square. Well, John, I think it doesn't work actually because well, let's say you do this, and once it happens, they occupy this square. How do you play then? So you cannot take with the knight because it's a fork. If you take with the bishop, then where this knight goes? Well, of course, it's not a tragedy, and you can play knight a8 and then later try to undermine it with f6, but seems that white is better in this position. Okay, bishop here, knight bd2, knight e4, I can castle. Your turn. So, knight c3. Okay. Well, this is a threat, right? And this is a threat too. Okay, okay, then I play c3 actually. I don't want to knight e4 to be played with a tempo. Okay. Um, so c5 was played. c5, castle, knight c6, and knight e5. Well, why c5 and knight c6 are played? Because the key idea is to fight for the d4 square. And at a certain moment of the game, play d4 ourselves to make this bishop a bad bishop. So knight e5. So now doing d4, well, it's possible, but we lack in development. That's why let's finish our development first. Well, instead of d3, they could also play d4 and transpose to a stone wall. But, well, then the bishop is restricted a bit. And, well, the next game we are going to talk about is about this pawn structure. So we can analyze how exactly you can deal with it in the next game. But generally speaking, you can do this move and try to play f6, undermining this knight on e5. Maybe first it makes sense to play this move, so you have in mind the ideas of take, take, and something like knight b4, if it works. So, well, we'll see. So d3 was played this time, castle, knight d2, and let's fight for the e5 square. Let's play knight d7. If, for example, d4 in this position, we can just play f6. For example, they may take on c6 and then continue with bishop g4, but it is not so promising, just f5. Well, it's not a weakness. However, we can still let him go to e5 with his knight. Then we have to take it. So here, I think we may focus on the queenside play, but the position is just very slightly better for black. So knight df3 looks like a logical move. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. Knight takes again, and f takes e5. Interesting, right? Because what's wrong with bishop takes e5, for example? Because with the f pawn, they block the bishop. However, they have more control over the f6 square. And if, for example, here they were prepared for the attack and they had already pieces, well, the queen and the rook already on h3 and the queen that could join the attack quickly, then having the pawn on e5 would allow white to benefit, but not in this case. But before we continue with the game, let's discuss what happens if the bishop takes. Who can tell me? Yeah, so d4 and f6 coming. Not f6 right away because he just moves back. So d4 first, and then this bishop is trapped. When they take, we play f6 and it's trapped. If, for example, they try to escape with f5, then we can do queen d5, right? So it's a double attack. So they play bishop f3, we take here, they take there, we take here with a check. And then we up a pawn with more chances to play for a win because the dark squares are exposed on the king side, and we may initiate the attack with the opposite colored bishops. Okay, so that's why pawn takes on e5. Bishop g5. This is a weakness. e4 doesn't work, it's just a pawn loss. What do you think white should play in this position? What's the point of c4? C4, so c4, then bishop takes d3, king here, then just d4. So I don't see the point of c4 at all. Well, rook f3 leads to trouble because of d4. This is exactly what happened in the game. And yes, bishop c1 is the main move here. And well, that would help to secure the e3 pawn. But how would you continue in this case? D4? Well, D4 works only in case if they take on D4. What if they push the pawn forward? So G4, E4. Then, well, you can take, because if you want to attack this pawn, you may do it with queen C7. But before that, you have to exchange the queens. However, once it happens, they can bring the queen here, and they may initiate some attack. That's why definitely not d4. Maybe queen c7 earlier, you mean in this position, but then they can play d4 and everything seems to be protected. So, why I decided to pause it at this moment, because this is a critical situation which you may definitely face. Those of you who prefer react with d5 against b3 are likely to weaken the e5 square, and white is likely to continue with f4. So in most of your games with b3 and d5, there will be the white pawn on e5 finally. Well, bishop h6, I think just d4. Well, here, look, with bishop c1, they undeveloped their pieces. Their rook on a1 is not participating in the game. So this pawn is doubled. These pawns are doubled, but the pawn on e5 is a bit annoying, so it makes sense to exchange it. Because doing d4 this time doesn't make any sense, because then the pawn on e5 definitely will be weak. So let's say this, take, and you just play queen c7, and they have no ideas of how to defend it. Well, this move loses the pawn on e3. So that's why this f6 pawn should be captured. And then we capture with the rook, with the idea of bringing the queen to the game, and then the rook, trying to pressure the enemy position and maybe attack this pawn once again. So for example, rook b1, queen d6, and we want to double. So we take with the bishop, they play bishop f3, rook f8. So this becomes a kind of a threat. No, it's not a threat. Let's say they play bishop d2, and with e5, we are ready to play e4, for example. Let's say this move, then e4, and well, this position should be fine. So what's the point? So because we do not want to lose the material, but here we can just continue with bishop e5. They have to play h3, and then we capture on e4. Because if they capture there, we capture here, then the king is too exposed. For example, king h1, and after this move, they are in trouble because we are coming with such a strategy. So if, let's say, bishop g4 trying to close it, it's rook f1 mate. So something like that. Just you may not calculate these lines, but just remember that when there is a pawn on e5, opening the position on the king side with f6 does make sense, because this is how you can get rid of this annoying pawn and bring more of your pieces to the place of action. Anyway, rook f3 was played, and then after d4, Larsen was punished. He takes d4. However, it's not the end. If you think this is just an exchange loss, no, it's not. It was the exchange sacrifice, because if bishop f3, bishop takes bishop, our rook is hanging too. So bishop e3, let's say, king h1, and this is where Karpov decided to sacrifice the exchange back and played bishop d4. And that was actually a very clever idea. If instead he plays with the rook, then it's take, queen e2, bishop g5, and white has some, maybe not full, but some compensation. These bishops are too good. That's why bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and bishop takes a8. Rook takes a8, a4. What can we say about this position? White is worse because the number of
Why didn't
uh-huh.
why didn't White try to save the E5 pawn instead of A4?
But how? Well, you can only do it with queen e1 move, because queen e2, queen h5 blunders the rook. So let's say queen e1, then rook goes here, then with rook d5, I just take it anyway. So that's why I think White did the right idea. He decided to create some counterplay with a4. Okay, just once again, queen e1, rook d8. Well, how? Well, this move, but then it's already this, and the pawn is lost. Well, maybe, well, the point is that there is no way to bring the queen to e2 because this rook is always hanging, and you first need to spend the tempo with the rook here or there, and only then continue with queen e2, defending the pawn. So this pawn is lost anyway. So materially it's equal, but the e5 pawn is lost. So a4, rook d8, a5, b5 is fine. a6, and then he captured the pawn. So black is a pawn up, the position is completely winning. However, some accuracy is required. And this is where they both starting making mistakes. But what I didn't like is that Anatoly Karpov made a lot of mistakes. So rook a5, the b5 pawn is hanging. How do we deal with it? So I can give you a hint here. It was important for black before trying to play for a win. It was important to consolidate the position. I mean, to get rid of the weaknesses. To avoid complications and not allow the white to create any counterplay. So b4 locks down the position, and this is the move that was played. But the point is that it's bad because not only because it locks the position, but because of something else. I'll show you. This is just a complete blunder. There is a pin. So what else? Queen c3, well, I don't see the point of queen c3 because rook b5. And if you think that you can do this quickly, no, you cannot because of rook b8. So the move that they had to play in this position was queen b8. Then rook d5, then queen b6, maybe h6 too. Let me just show you. Queen f3, rook d5. Queen goes here, queen b6. So we are not attacking the rook. Yeah, we are attacking the rook because the back rank isn't weak. So rook a1, h6, h3, and only then continue with b4, and then try to activate your rook. So rook a1, for example, then maybe you can try to attack the pawn or just queen d6. Queen d6 looks fine too, but well, maybe king h7 first. I like queen d6 because this endgame should be winning. This pawn is a weakness. I just need to bring my king closer to the center. If this move, well, rook c6, and this is stable enough, so the best move is this. Then king goes to h7 first, and once it happens, I take on a6. But if it doesn't happen, then I can first bring my king to f6, maybe e5 too, and then I capture here. So before doing queen d6, g5, and king f7. Well, and what if after queen d6 he rejects to exchange the queens? Then maybe g5 and king f7 will create more options for him to initiate the attack through f3. So before doing queen b8, what about rook d4? Well, rook d4, rook b5, and then what do you have in mind? Because, well, this move I play h3. You have to think about the back rank, because if your attack becomes unsuccessful, then the material is equal because you sacrifice the pawn. So queen b8 and the consolidating plan was the best option. So b4 was played instead, and then rook b5 would work perfectly well. However, Bent Larsen didn't play it. Then, for example, well, this is a threat, right? So rook d7 is a must. But then queen g1, covering the back rank and pressuring here. And this time rook c7, which by the first glance defends everything, is a complete blunder because of rook b8, which leads to a mate. And if this move, it's rook b7, and we'll lose the pawn on a7, which is even more risky. Luckily, they played queen g1 immediately and allowed black to play the move which saved the position, but black again made a mistake. So black played rook d5 and only gained the tempo. But if they play this move, it would be much better. So the same idea, we stop the attack of the c5, as well as we have in mind that we can bring the rook to the attack. I'll show you. For example, rook b5, h6 to avoid complications. Rook b7, rook f4. They take, we play this move. Rook f1. So what they can do, if, for example, they just play a random move, this is a mate. If they play h3, we take, king h2, another check, maybe g3 this time, and just queen e1. And the rook is always tied down to this pawn, which allows us to bring the king to f6, maybe play these moves, maybe capture the pawn on c2 with a check, and then bring our queen back. So we can at least create a pass pawn by doing f5, e4, e5, e4, and so on. Okay, so that's why the best reaction to rook f1 is actually rook h8. King takes and a8 equals queen. King h7, but this is still a losing position because, well, calculate the number of pawns. Black is 1 pawn up, so probably queen e4 is the best way. Queen takes e4. If pawn takes, this is a losing in game. It's a pawn in game without a pawn, that's why it's losing. So, and after queen f1, we play queen e3, and this is more complicated, but still winning. This is still winning because, well, this king is relatively safe. This one is in the trouble, and of course, there is a plan of doing a pass pawn like that. So rook d4 was a really good idea, but rook d5 was played by Karpov. Rook b5, h5. This is an escape square just. So here, for example, white was able to gain a pawn with this move. Queen moves d takes c5, and now I think it's equal. Maybe we don't need to take on h5, we may play king h7, but then, well, the rook should be exchanged at a certain moment of the game, and there is no extra pawn, so the game should end in a draw. But they play rook b7, considering that once they take on a7, they may win the game. And so this is what happened in the game, quite similar to what I demonstrated before. Rook a7, rook f1. The queen is trapped. It can only go to here, to c5. But once the queen goes to c5, who knows what happens? Queen to the first rank, but you have to be accurate. Which exact square on the first rank? Yeah, here Brian is correct. It's queen to d1. Well, rook f5. Rook f5 gains a tempo, but how do we succeed after that? So queen d1 just to stop queen h5. So they can do a check. King goes there, but then no more checks, and this move leads to a mate. There is no way to save it. So, for example, g3 loses the game right away. Yeah, so that's why they have to sacrifice the queen, and then Karpov was able to win this endgame. Let me just quickly show you what happened. a7, this rook is a bit more active, but who cares? Well, actually, we have to sacrifice this pawn, I think, or maybe we could play f6 here. But okay, king h7, king g6. It's still a losing position. So you see, queen e5 doesn't work because then we do not control the a8 square. The king moves, queen c7, and they promote. Queen e2. So rook c5, but then the king enters the enemy territory and there is a mating threat. Queen a7. So for example, if they played back to defend it, after king g3, there is a mating threat that they cannot get rid of. Once this pawn is lost, there is nothing to talk about. The queen is definitely stronger than the rook. So king h2, queen a7, and then it's completely winning position. However, they played for how many? Almost 18 moves more, and only then white resigned. We are not going to continue looking at this game. Just let's summarize the main part. So this and this are required to play d4, or at least to threaten d4 if you decide to choose d5 strategy against the b3 move. And it's quite important to fight against this knight on e5, so you can try to play f6 undermining the knight, maybe knight d7 also, but it's just possible to capture on e5 and undermine with f6, even if you exchange the bishops actually. Here black had a better idea because they could force black to get their other bishop undeveloped, and then f6 would work perfectly well. Okay, so we are done with this game. The second game against Giro and Piquet, we will just take a look at the very beginning. b3, d5, bishop b2, knight f6, a3, bishop g4. Well, another possible way. So why this move is played? Because it's a tempo gaining move, and because e6 blocks the diagonal. Bishop a2, they are exchanged. Knight b d7. Well, which is a bit suspicious. I would still suggest playing this. Maybe after c5 they didn't like this idea, but then I think knight d7 looks good enough. Or queen d7, and if they take on c5, it's e5, and well, black is down a pawn, but black is well developed at the same time. So queen goes here, bishop d6, castle, and for a pawn, black definitely had the compensation. If you, for example, turn the engine in this position, it will show you that you are better. It's minus 0.3 even without a pawn. So c5 is a must, but knight bd7 was played. f4, well, the same strategy. Well, here the engine considers it to be an accuracy, but I think this is a very logical move. e6, knight f3, bishop d6, castle, queen e7. It looks quite similar to the strategy that John suggested. c4, c6, knight c3. At least white developed all their pieces. a6, which is not required here, but okay. Castle, d4 is played. And what should we do against this pawn structure? c4, d4 with the pawn on f4, and the dark squared bishop of white is fianchetted to the b2 square. What do you think we typically should do? So b5 by Brian, well, Brian b5, c5, and this is how they close the position on the queen side. Because if black wants to play somewhere, it should be either in the center or on the queen side. Black has no prospects for the king side play. That's why c5 is quite logical. This move was played, so knight e5, rook a c8, and g4. So c takes d4 is fine in order to open the position. But the next move that was played by black, d takes c4, doesn't look so good. So here you have to take actions on the king side. White is very slightly better and is going to play g5, after which you have to play knight e8. That's why it makes sense to play h6. And h6 equalizes the position. Why? Well, if g5 is played right away, you can take and then play knight here. Because if they decide to protect, then knight g5. If h takes g5, you take here and then gain the third pawn. Queen e3, queen f2, queen e5, plus you have a strong attack. So this position is already favorable for black. Well, what else? If they play h4, which I think is a better idea than g5, then bishop takes e5, f takes e5, and knight h7. You simply stop it. Then this is an object of the attack here. h4 is also hanging, so I think that such a pawn advance actually weakened the white position. So h6 would stop the counterplay on the king side. I mean, that would stop the attack on the king side because that would provide you with some tactical opportunities to to refute it, to refute the attack. Okay, so h6, g5. This is one more line that I would like to talk about. h4, they take, and knight d7 move. What do you think? How to play in this position? Because if we take here, they take there, and we cannot bring the queen to the attack. So yeah, maybe it does make sense to play this move. And after king g2, what should we do? If we just take here, they take on h3. Maybe we can continue with e5 here, but then queen g4 and what? That's why queen h4. So we may let them take on f8, because after that we have a very strong attack. So if king takes, it's a mate on g3. If king goes there, it's still a mate on g3. So the king goes to h1 only, and then it's queen h4. And we are still threatening with a mate. With knight f2 here and here. So how do they play? Maybe rook f3. Then you are down a rook in this position, but you can always gain the exchange by playing this move. So actually, I think they have to do this move, and then you definitely have a compensation because you have at least two pawns and yeah, at least two pawns and the attack to compensate a piece. I also think that there is a perpetual check if you want. So h6 would be quite promising. The game continued with this move, b takes c4, rook f d8, and g5 is a must. Then I think the black player wanted to play knight e8, but after knight e4, bishop b8, looks like the black's position is crowded, their pieces are a bit passive. Well, knight d6 is coming, but I would prefer playing this position for white. As for rook a1, it's fine. This pawn was just simply taken, bishop a1, and in this position just bishop b4, so there is no compensation. I don't understand the point of sacrificing the pawn on a3. So this is what happened later in the game. f6 was played, the knight was forced to take, and c5 trying to restrict the bishop, but well, black is already slightly better. Then both players started making mistakes, so I think this game no longer deserves our attention. Here, by demonstrating this example, I wanted to show you that even with a weird way of developing your pieces against this setup, it makes sense to continue with c5. And once you see that your opponent opens his king to initiate the attack with his pawns on the king side, you should look for a counterplay in the center, as well as think about your defensive resources such as h6. But these defensive resources shouldn't be based on just, well, okay, so they want to play g5, I can play h6. You should make this move when you calculate that you're okay with g5 and you are also okay with h4 and then g5. Fine, so we have the last game to talk about. It's the game between Bent Larsen and Miguel Najdorf. So here Najdorf chose the Sicilian setup. f4 was played. Well, and this time he played d5, transposing to what we already know. a3, knight f6, knight f3, bishop e7. Well, what can you say about bishop b5 move in this position? Who does it favor, white or black? So John thinks it's okay. It favors black. Brian thinks it's slightly better for black. Well, guys, can you explain your opinion? Yeah, so the bishop on c8 is restricted, and according to what we saw from previous games when d5 was played, this bishop isn't good, and black is trying to develop it in with different strategies. Mainly it's fianchetto, but here there is an option to trade this bishop, and that's why that would help a lot. Because most of black pawns are located on light squares, most of white pawns are located on dark squares. So this bishop would help them to initiate the attack. But I think the reason why they traded is that it provides them with some space to maneuver with the queen, and maybe have they could bring the queen to the attack faster. a4. So this is where I would play a6. Or maybe first let's castle, and then I would definitely play a6. Well, the next question is maybe a bit confusing. Well, is this a good move or not? Okay, so John thinks that we should take with the queen, fall under this attack, and then I'll move our queen to c7. Okay, Paul, you prefer knight c6, but you mean which? So the knight belongs to c6. And that means that you take on d7 with which piece? Well, both knights can take on d7, the f or the b. So the f knight. Okay, clear. Yeah, so taking with the f knight is the key. Well, you guys, well, Paul missed the first part of our event, but we were talking about the e5 square and how it is important when we have such a pawn structure with the pawn on d5. Well, then we play this move, and what is important too is that we can play bishop f6 and neutralize this bishop at all. Yeah, exactly, exactly. And even after that, we can play e5, opening the position. So because we dominate in the center, that would favor us. So knight fd7 with these ideas. Well, knight c6 was played in the game. I don't like this idea, but well, finally, for some reason, uh, here Miguel Najdorf provoked white to capture the knight. But I think it's actually favorable for white because now the knight on e5 is more stable. Well, if he let white to set up the knight on e5 and has a bishop pair, I think it could make sense to play this move, then knight d7 and f6, keeping the bishop pair and trying to activate the light squared bishop oops, through g6, for example, after f6. That would make sense. Because, for example, well, it depends on how they play, but every time we can play knight d7 and f6, it shouldn't be a problem. Okay, so knight e5, rook c8, a5, knight goes to d7 to try to exchange. And then, well, maybe because of bishop f6 coming, maybe because pawn f6 is coming, well, white decided to take on c6 right away. So rook takes, of course, rook takes. Well, for those who would like to capture with the b pawn, first of all, there is a pawn on a6 hanging, but it's not fully hanging because then after queen c7 we can try rook e8 and we gain the pawn on a5 back. But the problem is that this pawn structure is completely useless. If you think that you reinforce the center, well, yes, you do. But how does it help your position? So if you take with the rook, you have this idea, you have this idea in mind, but in this, it's the only logical thing that comes to my mind is to get the rook to the b8 square and then play c4, trying to take advantage of this pin. Well, they can play c4 actually. Okay, so do not, well, when you take with the b pawn on c6 and double your pawns, just try to evaluate the benefits that you get and the disadvantages that you also have to face with once you take with the b pawn. So taking with the rook is definitely logical. So d3, c4, exactly, exactly. So this is what was played. We are okay to lose a pawn because it's just a temporary loss. The pawn is a weakness. We can gain this pawn. We can gain the pawn on c4 later in the game. That's why they just played d4. And we played knight f6 to control the key squares. c3, b5. If, for example, in this position, white decides to play knight d2, we play knight d5, they play e4, which seems that they have an advantage, then knight b4 and the knight goes here. Because if they take c3 and both pawns are hanging, we gain the piece back and both pawns are hanging. So, for example, this move, right? But then it's queen d4 check, and queen b4. Well, it depends. For example, queen f2. Oh, queen f2, we can do what? Well, taking on b4, I think, is the best option. Taking on b4. Well, if they play this move, we just bring the bishop. Yes, right. Thank you. So king h1, king h1. Well, I still, well, this move is fine. No, this move is still fine. And if they play bishop a1, we continue with this move, right? So, and after knight b3, it's still fine. So we just promote these pawns. Even without a piece, we are completely winning. Okay, so that's why en passant. After b5 and passant. But that opens the b file and allows black to obtain a counterplay through that file. So bishop takes a3, rook takes a3, and knight goes to d5. So we are always ready to enter the enemy camp, and that's why they have to keep an eye on it. Rook e1. Well, queen b7. This is a very sneaky move because there is a pressure here, as well as this move vacates the b6 square for the rook. So queen c2, rook b6. Well, if e4, we just take the pawn on f4 first. If knight d2, then rook b2, queen c1, and rook b8. Who can tell me what's wrong with knight c4? Because this move attacks the rook, and then knight a5 can be played as well, or e4 can be played. So what's wrong with knight c4? Yeah, guys, so you're absolutely correct. So it's rook g2, but then some accuracy is required. You should start with knight f4. Well, this loses because of queen g2 mate. That's why the only square is g3. However, then still queen g2, king takes f4. Well, king takes f4 is a must, right? Because if this move, g5 is a mate. So king takes f4, queen f2, then f5. Well, he may go here. Actually, this is what I didn't. Just a quick mate on f3, queen g4. And if king goes to g5, it's h6. King h5, we just move our queen and checkmate on g6. Well, if here, then I think it's just the same mate, but on g4. Yeah, so it's a checkmate anyway. So that's why they have to not take this pawn, so it's not hanging, and this diagonal is quite important. So they have to protect f4 and only then play e4 to close this diagonal. So rook a5, but f5, now e4 is impossible, and the pawn is still not hanging because of the same combination. h3, h6, king h1, well, now the pawn may be hanging because rook g2 is played without a check. That's why knight goes back to f6, and if knight c4 now, it's just queen g2 mate. So probably white should choose passive defense, but I don't think that they would survive there. Well, rook g1, king h7 is a prophylaxis, and then we can try to exchange pieces with knight e4 maybe. Well, we should also keep an eye on the pawn on c4 here. Well, let's say rook g1, king goes here, and if they take on c4, what do you think? How should we play? Well, maybe something like this, just. And then try to bring the knight to the game. Well, okay. Well, rook takes g2, of course, this time doesn't work. Okay, so, well, it was still possible to sacrifice the pawn on c4, but rook e5 was played in the game to pressure here. However, it was definitely a mistake. Rook a2. Now this rook is trapped, so if he takes on e6, then we can continue with queen f7 and bring the rook to the second rank, after which they won't survive. That's why they played rook g1 to protect on g2 first, queen f7 anyway. And this is our next move. So here, well, they'd better take on c4. The game would continue with knight f4. There is a threat of doing this, for example. There is a threat of doing this move. Well, they are in trouble. And even if they play king h2, there is a threat of this and knight g4 with queen h5. Well, queen h5 first, then knight g4. Oh, let me just show you. So let's say knight f2. So they, for example, oh, okay, no, this move probably doesn't, well, this move, then rook e2. Yeah, let me just show you the idea. So knight f2, while I don't know how they play, maybe let's say queen e1, you play this move. Now they need to do something with the fork. So let's say they move the rook, you play this, the king moves h1, and then queen h3 wins the game. So this is another threat. So that's why white made a mistake here and played e4. And after, yeah, well, knight h5, knight g3, well, is also a threat. So, and after this move, there is nothing to discuss. Knight takes c4 with a tempo, but rook c2 is a tempo gaining move too. And then the pawn on e4 is lost. So you see, it was very favorable for black to exchange the c4 pawn for the e4 pawn. Not because the e pawn is more important than the c pawn, but because the knight on e4 is more centralized than the one on c4. So rook e2 is a threat here. Queen g6 is a threat too. Well, d5 was played. E takes d5, knight b6, and just rook takes c3. Well, then the position is completely lost. Queen h5, well, threatening to sacrifice on h3. Queen d5 with a check. Well, there was nothing that could save the game, so white decided to use their last chance. And then they took here, which does make sense, but actually it doesn't save the game because it's a very quick checkmate. Rook h3, pawn takes, queen takes, and the only thing they can do is to block with the queen, and then it's just knight f2. So this is how the game is ended. Miguel Najdorf won with this nice combination. So what you can remember from this game? Well, first of all, that the d4 square is still important. If they offer an exchange of the bishops, I think, well, I'm 100% sure it's favorable for black. Yeah, so doing this would work really well, but if that happens, do not forget about the control of the e5 square. So knight fd7, then knight c6, and you cover the e5 square, and you can even exchange the bishops. So neutralizing this bishop would be a really good idea, because this is what white hoped on when they chose this setup. However, even if that doesn't happen and you let them occupy e5, you can still fight on the queen side by opening the position there, which exactly happened in the game. So once the b file became open, black entered with their major pieces with rook b6, rook b2, and because of that, their attack was stronger than any potential attack that white could initiate. Okay, so looks like we are done for today. Do you have any questions, guys? We covered several strategies of how to play against b3 in case if they choose different pawn center. Well, usually it's the pawn on f4. Sometimes it's d4 and this. Sometimes it's just c4 with this pawn structure, which happened in the first game that Boris Spassky played. Well, again, if depends on what you like more. You can play d5 or you can react with e5. You are likely to have a very playable position anyway. Even if you just play c6, c5, e6, similar to Sicilian, it still works, but such an opening assumes that you will play d5 after that. Okay, so we are done for today. We meet next Sunday, and I actually want to slightly change uh, the structure of our webinars and maybe make them more like interactive lessons. If you have any ideas what activity I should include, message me at tricksofchess@gmail.com. Also, guys, any suggestions of how I can make these webinars or lessons more interactive? Any suggestions are welcome. So tricksofchess@gmail.com. You can message me if you have any questions, if you have any suggestions, or just any requests. So you're welcome. Yeah, maybe I will also provide you with some homework. Yes, it will be quite clever. Okay, so thank you for coming and see you next Sunday.